raging throughout the land, and thousands of refugees were fleeing into Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. And there was a family in Baja called the Villaseñor family, and they were very poor, but they saved money for months and months to be able to afford the train tickets that would take them into Southern California. And they had a little son named Juan, who was about 10 years old, and they'd walked for weeks through the desert to get to the little village where the train would stop and take them into Southern California. And when they got there, they had to wait a few days for the train to arrive. And little Juan did what most little boys would do. He found some other little boys, and they began to play games and goof off to pass the time. And one of their favorite things that they did was to run foot races to see who was the fastest. And on the day the train finally got there, they decided to have one last foot race. But they threw in an element from the game of chicken. And the test was this: the 5 little boys stood at the back of the train. And when the train took off, they waited to see which boy would chicken out first and run and catch the train. And you know how trains are, right? They start off slow. And the 5 little boys were waiting. And then finally, one little boy took off like a shot and ran and caught the train. And now the train's going a little faster. And 2 more boys took off like a shot and ran and caught the train. And now it's just little Juan and his friend. And little Juan looked at the train, he looked at his friend, he looked at the train, looked at his friend. And finally they both took off as fast as they could, and they ran. And they could barely touch the guardrail at the back of the train. But they could not grasp it, and they fell over in a heap. And little Juan looked up through his tears, and he could see the train disappearing into the horizon. And his friend stood up and he laughed at Juan. And Juan looked at him and he said, "What are you laughing at? There goes the train. There goes your family. There goes my family. We're never going to see him again." And his friend said, my cousins live here in town. I'm going to go stay with my cousins. And he left Juan lying on the train tracks. Little Juan stood up and he looked around the Baja desert and he dusted himself off. And he did the only thing he knew to do, which was to chase that train. And he did. Barefoot through the Baja desert, he ran and he ran and he ran, and he stopped and he looked at his feet. His feet were bleeding, and he cried and he rested. And he did something his grandfather had taught him to do, which was how to extract the juices from the cactus in order to survive and keep his body hydrated. And he spent a cold, miserable night in the Baja desert. But he woke up the next morning and he walked and he ran and he walked and he ran. And 24 hours later, he got to the little village where the train had stopped. And when he got there, he began to ask around, "Have you seen my family? Have you seen my family?" And at first people said, "No, we haven't seen them." And finally somebody said, "Yes, they're over there." And when he saw his mother, he ran and he jumped into her arms, and his mother scooped him up in her arms and used the term of endearment my mother still uses for me to this day. "Mijito, mijito, my precious son, how did you get here? Es un milagro. It's a miracle. How did you get here?" And little Juan, all he could do was hug her and cry, because you see, even he himself did not realize how he had gotten there. And when I thought about that story, I thought, wow, that's motivation. That's motivation. And I wondered, what if I offered little Juan a big hunk of gold medal and said, "Juan, what I want you to do is run barefoot through the Baja desert with no food, no water for 24 hours. And if you do that, I'll give you this medal." Would that have been enough? And somehow I think no. But Juan did it. Why? Because he had a big enough reason why. He had a big enough reason why. You see, it's not enough to have a list of goals. You learn how to set goals in high school, right? Some of you brokers have your agents write quarterly goals, right? How many deals are you going to close this quarter, right? Is that working? Is that working, really? Why isn't it enough? Why aren't goals enough? Because we know now that you have to have motivation. You have to have a big enough reason why. So tonight, before your head hits the pillow, I challenge you to sit down and write down your list of big enough reasons why you're going to catch your dream, because if you don't, you're never going to get up off the couch. Your goals aren't going to do it. You've got to have your list of big enough reasons why. Do you have a big enough reason why? I challenge you to write down your list of big enough reasons why tonight before your head hits the pillow. Now, a lot of you may say, "Okay, that's a cool story, Dan. I get that, and that's interesting. But you don't understand my situation. You don't know where I've been. You don't know where I am. You don't know how little money I have. You don't realize that if I don't pay my mortgage next month. If I don't close a deal, my house is going to be foreclosed on. You don't understand that my mom was just diagnosed with cancer. I had to borrow money to get here. And you're right, I don't know your exact situation. I don't know where you are, where you've been, where you've come from. But I can tell you that I have been at the very bottom, and I've come back. About 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to be in the British Virgin Islands during sea turtle nesting season. And I met a marine biologist who was keeping vigil every night, walking up and down the beach with a flashlight, looking for nesting turtles. And I said to the guy, hey, if you see a turtle nesting, I'd love to see that. Could you come knock on my door? You know, I mean, that would be really awesome. And he said, sure. So a couple of nights later, I hear a knock at the door. And the guy said, hey, there's a giant leatherback sea turtle that just crawled out of the ocean. She's looking for a place to dig her nest. So I ran down to the ocean and I saw her. She was about 6 feet long from head to tail. And she was crawling around and she finally found just the right spot. And with her hind flippers, she started digging about a 3-foot deep hole. And when the hole was dug, she began to drop the eggs out of her body and they landed in the hole. And when they landed, they shook like jello. And I remember stroking her back and listening to her breathe. And it was a phenomenal experience. It was like walking onto the set of the Discovery Channel. And I thought, wow, this is it. This is the highlight of the whole trip. It doesn't get any better than this. But 2 nights later, I heard another knock at the door. And this time the guy said one word. He said, babies! Babies! So I ran down to the beach as fast as I could, and I saw hundreds of little baby sea turtles flapping their wings, trying to get to the ocean. And I was tiptoeing around, trying not to step on them, you know. And I said, hey, how do they know where to go? You see, for the last 3 hours, these turtles have been digging out of a 3-foot deep hole, and the first thing they ever saw in their life was turtle butts and sand. You know? And when they popped out of the hole, they looked around and went, hey, where am I? Where do I go? What do I do? So I said to the guy, how do they know where to go? And the guy said, well, that's easy. They just follow the light. I thought, they follow the light. And I knew there was something deeply profound about what he was saying. I said, what do you mean they follow the light? He goes, well, you see the moon and the stars, they shine on the ocean, and they make the ocean just a little bit brighter than the rest of the land. And the turtles see that light, and they instinctively follow the light. And he said, if you have a flashlight, what I want you to do is shine it on the sand and walk towards the water, because the turtles will also follow the false light. And they will die, and that's why it's illegal in those countries to have lights on the outside of your buildings, hotels and condos. So I remember shining my flashlight on the sand and walking towards the beach, and I looked behind me, and there was a little trail of baby sea turtles following me like a little Pied Piper, and I was going, come on, baby sea turtles! And I remember standing ankle deep in water and watching these little baby sea turtles disappear in tiny little splashes into the ocean. And it was an amazing feeling of euphoria. And it brought healing to my soul. And you see, at that moment, I was in need of some healing because it was probably the lowest point in my entire life. I'd graduated from a top 10 law school with honors. Went to work for a huge, giant law firm, one of the biggest on the planet, called Vincent & Elkins. For a long time, I represented Fortune 500 companies in multi-billion-dollar litigation. After a few years, I went to work for one of those corporations that continued litigating multi-billion-dollar cases. After a few years, I left that company. Some friends of mine and I put together a small boutique litigation law firm, and we started suing those companies, which is a lot more fun. And we started winning multi-million-dollar verdicts, and our names were in all the papers. And eventually, we had clients all over the U.S., and in China, and in Africa, and in British Columbia. And I was on top of the world. I thought I'd made it. But one day, my business partner and I had a bitter business dispute. And I was on the losing end of that dispute. So one day I found myself on the street with no desk, no computer, no files, no secretary. And I remember doing a lot of praying in those days. And I remember driving to the CompUSA because I was going to buy my first laptop computer, because that was going to become my virtual office. And I remember when I got out of the car, my cell phone rang, and I remember it like it was yesterday. The guy on the other end said, oh, this is Joel Silverstein, and we've got an emergency hearing down in Austin, Texas. We heard you're a pretty good lawyer. We'd like you to represent the guy. How much money do you need? And I'm like, Doug, is that you? Who is this really? No, this is Joel Silverstein, and we've got an emergency hearing down in Austin, Texas. We'd like you to represent the guy. How much money do you need? We'll FedEx it to you. You'll have it tomorrow. So I said, well, You see, in these situations, our standard retainer is $10,000, and if you think you can handle it, I'll give you our address. So he did. He sent the check. I had it the next day. Represented the client for a few years, built up my practice, had a law partner. Now we have an office in Las Vegas and in Austin, Texas. Eventually we had clients all over the country. Belgium, Switzerland, France, China, Jamaica. A few years after that, I bought a real estate franchise from the wrong company. Then I started a mortgage company and a property management company and a boot camp for entrepreneurs called Entrepreneurology. Eventually, I wrote this book. There's my book. There it is. I've been very blessed because it won some awards and now it's selling all over the world. And when I think about these things, I'm extremely humbled and honored and blessed. But my mind always goes back to those tiny baby sea turtles. You want to know why? Because at that time, none of these good things had happened. It was still the lowest point in my life, right? And I remember going back to that very same beach the next night, sitting there on the beach by myself, looking over the vast ocean, worrying about my babies. Because you know what happens to those guys, right? Before they even hit the water, they're gobbled up by coyotes and foxes and seagulls. And once they hit the water, they're gobbled up by bigger fish and by sharks like appetizers. And there's a lot of sharks in my industry, and I was feeling a lot like an appetizer in those days. So as I was looking out over the ocean, contemplating their fate, something occurred to me. And I went, wait a minute. These guys have been around for millions of years. They tell us these guys are living dinosaurs. They've been around longer than we have, and yet somehow, despite the odds, and despite the obstacles, they've not only survived, but they've prospered. And it was in that moment as though the baby turtle spoke to me. Now, don't get me wrong. Turtles don't speak to me. So don't walk out of here going, turtles, speak to him. But it was in that moment as though the moon, the stars, and the wind, and the ocean waves, and yes, even the baby turtles united in one voice and spoke a message to me. And it was weird because the message seemed to have the same rhythm as the ocean waves. The earth always provide for her own. Like what? The earth will always provide for her own. And as I thought about it, I went, yeah, isn't that right? Isn't that right? The earth will always provide for its own. And aren't I one of the earth's own? And aren't I at least as significant as one of those tiny baby sea turtles? And it was in that moment that I knew I was not just going to survive, but I was going to prosper beyond my wildest dreams. And if you get in my car today, there's a plastic sea turtle on my dashboard. Because those are my guys, those are my heroes, those are my reminders from God and the universe that I'm not just going to make it, but I'm going to prosper beyond my wildest dreams. That's how I take back my focus. When I'm stuck in traffic, I grab the little turtle and I just rub it. Not for good luck, but to take back my focus, right? And the same is true for you. For those of you who have learned to take back your focus and take back your beliefs, for those of you who have a mantra, for those of you who have a list of big enough reasons why, for those of you who stand and boldly declare to the universe, I'm not just going to survive, but I'm going to make it. I'm going to prosper beyond my wildest dreams. An amazing thing happens. The universe answers back. The universe answers back. And strange, magical coincidences start to happen to you. Deals start falling out of the sky you weren't counting on. Referrals come your way you weren't expecting. People enter your life you weren't trying to meet, weren't expecting to meet, and they put their arm around you and take you by the hand and say, follow me. Let me show you the way. Just do what I do. So today I urge you to do the same thing that heroes and legends have done for thousands of years. Take back your focus. Take back your beliefs. Take back your mantra. If you don't have a mantra, you can borrow mine. There is no such thing as a problem without a solution. Say it with me. There is no such thing as a problem without a solution. And finally, always remember the message of the baby sea turtles. The earth will always provide for its own. And aren't you one of the earth's own? Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Thank you.